So if we're thinking about the one thing that you could do on your financial journey, we broke it down into decades to make it a little simpler because we know everybody's at a different stage of life, and that one thing will differ depending on where you are in life. So we pointed out, and we got this idea from a tweet from Jeff Levine that had a lot of responses to it about one thing that you could do besides saving and investing generically, right? What could you do to improve your wealth? So Allison, let's jump into your teens and your 20s. What could be something there that you could do?
So the one thing in the teens and 20s is to find a way to harness the power of compound interest over time. Absolutely most important thing you can do to build long-term wealth for yourself and for your family. And we'll show you the illustration of that compound interest over time for someone who starts in their 20s versus someone in their 30s and 40s versus, and obviously somebody who's investing in growth assets like stocks over the long term versus just putting that money in a savings account at the bank.
Now, is this related to the One Direction song that we talked about in the podcast?
Well, when you proposed the idea, that's what I thought we were talking about. So right. Probably got a little more excited than the actual topic. But one thing I love about that song too is they never say what the one thing is. It's open to interpretation, and it could be different for everyone depending on what phase of life you're in and where you are on your wealth building journey.
Yeah, the fact is we all try to simplify things. There's multiple steps to get to reach success in all industries and cultures of life. Music often will capture that in a 3-minute version for us. In health, that we joked also in the podcast, you had the 6-minute abs at one point where, because everybody wants it to be simple and easy and just be one thing they can do to get there. The fact is it takes one thing happening a lot of times often to get you there through these decades. So let's move into the 30s. When you're in your 30s, what can you do there?
The most important thing for me in the 30s is to pay yourself first and give first if you're charitably inclined. So paraphrasing here, a quote by Dave Ramsey, if you only save and give what's left over after you pay all the rest of your expenses, then your budget is upside down. So in your 30s is when life can really start getting hectic. Maybe you're moving into a larger home, you're having a family, you're paying for childcare, you're considering private school. There might be a lot of demands on your time and your money. So it's very, very important to put first things first. Make sure you are continuing to pay yourself first, and the causes that you are passionate about are at the top of your budget.
Great steps there. So if you've accomplished these two things, you've now reached this plentiful period of the 40s. What are you thinking about in your 40s, that one thing you can do there?
Hopefully, yes, you have reached that phase in your 40s. And what we find can be difficult in your 40s is that the goalposts may keep moving. After you achieve a certain level of success, it's hard not to want more. So in your 40s, the one thing that I would say is the most important is to determine your definition of enough. What is enough in your life, and what is the risk worth to getting just a little bit more or hitting the next goalpost that may have moved since the last time you made that determination? Putting thought into that, and obviously communicating that with your spouse or anyone else who is invested in your financial situation so you're all on the same page.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer and worth some time to think about. But the social indifference idea that we get from The Millionaire Next Door and The Next Millionaire Next Door books, I think is incredibly important to set up some boundaries and discipline to guard against the Joneses' impact in your life that happens often subconsciously behind the scenes. Some of us are more apt to not fall into the temptation of that. However, if you can set up those boundaries beforehand while you're in your 40s, then that can stop a lot of that potential erosion of good work you might have done earlier on. All right, we're moving into the 50s. What's the one thing there we're looking at?
So the 50s, the one thing that is the most important, I would say, is flexibility. So hopefully if you've done the steps already laid out in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, you're in a strong financial situation. A lot of times what we find happens in the 50s is there are setbacks. There could be a career change, there could be layoffs, there could be a divorce, there could be health issues. So very, very important to maintain flexibility so that you can maintain the wealth that you've worked very hard to build. And I joked about this, relating to a Seinfeld episode where he makes a reservation for a rental car and he gets there and there is no rental car. And he says, anybody can just take a reservation, just take reservations, but you have to hold the reservation. So this is a time of life where it's very important to maintain the wealth that you've worked so hard to achieve. And having a sense of flexibility and being able to reinvent yourself can make that possible in your 50s.
Yes. And we talked about the importance of the network too, investing in your network so that if you are in that period of getting an early retirement situation when you're not ready for it, a forced early retirement situation, then you can benefit from having your network there that might help you find another opportunity, or you may have saved and done the things you needed to in these early decades to where you're ready to take that next transition into retirement. And thankfully, you've done your one things in each of the decades to get you there. And moving into the 60s, what's the one thing in your 60s that you can do?
That one thing in the 60s is perspective. Thinking about where you are now in your financial situation. And if you've done everything we talked about in the prior decades, you should be in a really strong financial position. Maybe you retired in your 50s, took an early retirement, or maybe you're looking at when do I retire in the next few years. So it's really important to have a perspective of what is this money for that I've accumulated? Do I want it to continue growing so that I leave an estate for my children or grandchildren? Or do we want to plan to spend the majority of this money over the rest of our lifetimes? Also important to have a perspective of some of those social and cultural norms or rules of thumb that are out there, and if they are appropriate for your situation. Do you need to enter retirement with your mortgage paid off? Should you take Social Security at 62 to make sure you get every dollar because Social Security might go bankrupt? Is there ever a reason to start pulling from your IRA before RMD age? So a lot of these things that we may hear on social media or the news as hard and fast rules that may not be right for you. So important to keep that perspective and look at it in the context of your long-term financial plan.
Healthy questions to ask, and that perspective can be used also in your investment strategy, because a rule of thumb that will be that you have to reduce risk. You don't need the same amount of stocks. Maybe not, right? I mean, it depends on how much you're withdrawing. So there's a lot of factors that you want to kind of hold up to what a conventional thought may be and say, is this actually right for me? In the context of financial planning and thinking through that, if you do it for yourself or adding a professional to along your team there to help you through that in your 60s. We're hitting that magical age of 70. What happens when you move into 70 and you're thinking about your one thing that you can do in that decade?
That one thing at age 70, if you've done everything in the prior decades, is continuity. So thinking about if you are the primary point of contact with your financial advisor for your family situation, making sure that you're bringing in your spouse, you're bringing in your adult children, you have continuity, you have, the ability for things to be carried on after you, or if something happens to you, you have that continuity and plans in place. If you haven't done that already in your 70s, I would say that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, communication is huge in this aspect, making sure everybody's on the same page and understanding where to go and find things. If you don't have an advisor, how are you going to make sure things proceed the way that you hope they do in that circumstance whenever you do pass on? Okay. And then if you're in that lucky phase of life, some would argue they're lucky, I guess, to make it to 80. Some would not, maybe, depending on their flexibility and health at that age. But if you make it to your 80s and beyond, what is our one thing that we're focusing on for success moving forward at that point?
80s and beyond, I would say protection is key. So making sure that there are safeguards in place. Unfortunately, we do find, that senior citizens are taken advantage of at times. There is an increased risk of fraud in this demographic. So that is what we really want to think about is protection, making sure that you have a team in place that you trust, whether that's family members, whether that's a fee-only financial advisor, so that you have more than one set of eyes on your financial situation and you're discussing any potential roadblocks or pitfalls with someone else who can give you an objective point of view.
Protection and reflection, I would say,
Yes.
right, in your 80s, because you're certainly looking back at a life well lived here after you've taken all these one things into consideration along your journey. So hopefully you've implemented some of these or can implement some of these in your life along your journey. If you need other help or are interested in many other topics, we write about that in over 500 articles at our website, financialsymmetry.com. You can check out other videos below here as well. And then check out our podcast with 130 episodes or so there at this point. So if you don't want to miss the next episode, you can subscribe here and we'll be back again in 2 weeks.